Hello. Hi. Yeah, my name is Peter Krykant, and I'm a drug user activist. I'm 43 years of old, and I'll just give you a little bit of background about the reasons that I do what I do. So, as a child, I did suffer some traumatic experiences and some adverse childhood experiences. And what I found is that when I took drugs, specifically cannabis, it took me away from that trauma. It gave me a chance to actually feel a part of the people, a part of people that I was hanging around with at the time. But my drug use very quickly spiraled out of control. I went from the age of 11 smoking cannabis on a daily basis to very quickly moving on to alcohol, which I would like to inform everybody that's watching this that is a drug, and it's probably one of the biggest killers that we have in society just now. But that progressed onto amphetamines and LSD, and then eventually onto intravenous heroin use. So by the age of 17, I was an intravenous heroin user, and I was doing that on a daily basis. I was unemployable. I got to the point where but the family had tried to support me. They tried to help me. They'd done everything that they could. They clearly loved me. I'm an only child, and my mum and dad separated and remarried when I was quite young. And both sets of parents tried to support me. They loved me, and they gave me everything that they could. However, there did become a point where I had stole so much from my parents that they could no longer continue to support me in certain ways. So, I ended up, by the age of 17, very quickly after taking heroin, I ended up in a situation where, I had to leave Scotland. The criminal record was piling up. I was criminalised consistently. I was in young offenders institution, essentially prison for children, because we're talking at 16 years of old, I'm sent to prison for alcohol and drug related offences. And eventually I had to leave Scotland. I was running away from, that criminality that I was involved in. The criminality was all based around my drug addiction. Shoplifting and offences like that were regular. However, I got to the point where I couldn't shoplift anymore. You could clearly see that I was addicted to drugs. Heroin and intravenous heroin use completely destroyed me as a person, both internally and externally, to the point where I weighed very little. I'm 6'2", and at the height of my heroin addiction, I weighed around 9 stone, so very underweight, very malnutrition, suffering from malnutrition. So I ended up heading down to Birmingham, and the reason that I headed to Birmingham was pure and simply because it was the first bus that came into Glasgow, Buchanan Street station. That's why I went to Birmingham, no other reason. And I got to Birmingham, and I was running away from myself. I really thought, once I get to Birmingham, I'll go to the housing association, I'll get things sorted out, I'll enter into a drug treatment program. The reality is that I entered into crack cocaine use when I got to Birmingham. Crack cocaine wasn't a thing in Scotland at that point. As soon as I got to Birmingham, the first person that I saw who was on the street, who was selling the big issue, I got them to get me drugs, and they introduced me to crack cocaine. So that just became another drug that I used on a daily basis along with heroin, and I used crack cocaine intravenous. So it was all intravenous drug use by that point, and nothing else really mattered. I was on high amounts of prescription medication, methadone, benzodiazepines, crack cocaine, and heroin. And I spent 3 years in Birmingham, and those 3 years, there was a lot of degradation. I was a public injecting homeless user. I used in abandoned buildings, car parks, toilets. I was arrested because I looked like a drug user in Birmingham. One day I was arrested, and I've still got the marks on my wrists from the handcuffs being so tightly put on my wrists. And we're going back over 20 years ago now, and I've still got the scars from that arrest. And that arrest was pure and simply because of how I looked. And that was the story of my drug use, and looking back at it now, It was a really sad existence, to be sleeping rough and begging every day for change, and having to use drugs in the way that I use drugs. However, that's kind of what spurred me into what I do today, in terms of setting up the first unsanctioned drug consumption facility in the United Kingdom. Because fast forward 20 years later, we're still treating people who use drugs exactly the same way. And it's absolutely ludicrous that we have all this evidence from around the world now, from countries like Canada, countries like Denmark, Switzerland, Portugal. The list is endless now from countries that have introduced reforms into how we deal with people who use drugs. And if we continue to go down the road that we're going in terms of where we're at in Scotland, I can only see the problem getting worse. We already in Scotland have the worst drug death rate in the Western world. We've got, from statistics now, which are over 2 years old, we have 218 people dying per million people in Scotland. On a yearly basis, you can line that up with countries like Canada. So we have countries like Denmark. So we have roughly about 1,200 people dying a year in Scotland. With a similar population, Denmark has roughly about 300 people. And it's no surprise that Denmark now has consumption facilities. They've been running for a number of years now. And people are able to go into those consumption facilities and be kept alive in the event of an overdose. What we're saying to the Scottish government and to the UK government is that we can no longer go down this route of criminalising people who use drugs, because it's not working. We've been fighting this war on drugs for 100 years now, and it's the war we've lost more people to this war than any other war in history. We need to start treating this as a health issue. I was ill when I was taking drugs. I didn't need criminalised or thrown in a prison cell. I was already suffering from trauma, and the way that I was treated was creating more trauma in my life. So what we're saying to people when they come to our drug consumption facility in Glasgow is that you are going to be using these drugs, but rather than dying in an alleyway, you can come where safe and protected and use them. And we can also talk to you about options for other treatment services while you're here, if you want to have that conversation. We don't want to force anybody into conversations that they don't want to have, but the majority of people that visit the consumption facility that I am operating want to have those conversations. People are tired of being treated like second-class citizens, being pushed into squalid, rat-infested conditions where they pick up infections, where it costs our NHS lots of money because people have to go into hospital to get those wounds treated. The businesses in Glasgow who I've been talking to are sick and tired of it as well. We're giving out needle exchange, so injecting equipment provision at pharmacies, but we're not giving anybody a place to actually use that injecting equipment provision. So they're taking the injecting equipment from the pharmacy, they're going 20 yards to an alleyway or to a communal entrance to a block of flats, or into alleyways where businesses are, and they're using in those places. Businesses are saying to me now that something needs to change, and what we're doing is we're looking at the experiences of again, places like Denmark, who have seen an 82% reduction in discarded equipment, places like Sydney, where their safer injecting facility reports that over 80% of the people who regularly attend that facility accept a referral into drug treatment services. When Scotland has a situation where we say that two-thirds of the people who are deemed to have problems with substances are not in any form of treatment, we have to look at how we're actually engaging with people. We're not meeting people where they're at. And the simple reality of what we face now in Scotland is that policing and crime is fully devolved. The Scottish Government and the Lord Advocate in Scotland need to step forward. They need to bring in a letter of comfort to allow Glasgow to operate one of these facilities. We can no longer rely on the UK government to make these changes. They've rejected these changes, the wholesale rejection of any conversations around drug consumption facilities. Now, the Scottish Government need to stop playing political football with this and really treat it like a health issue. They're the government that's overseen for the last 12 years an exponential increase in drug-related deaths. Professor David Nutt spoke to me recently in a podcast. He said that he's been saying for years that the Scottish government should go ahead and do this. What are the UK government going to do? Send in the tanks? Because we've opened a drug consumption facility to help the most vulnerable people in our society. Having been in that situation, having used dirty injecting equipment, having used and shared equipment with other people, I can no longer sit back and be part of a society that says that's okay. And society in Scotland is not saying that's okay anymore. Public opinion now is seeing that the evidence is there. The evidence is there to move towards a de facto decriminalisation so that a consumption facility can be operated in Glasgow. I would say to anybody listening or watching this, back this campaign, look at the evidence from multiple countries around the world. You know, we're not talking about a radical approach here. We're talking about something that's already been done all around the world to support and help people into healthier lifestyles to benefit society as a whole. In terms of working in drug treatment services, I did that for a long time as well. After a long period of time working in sales, I switched my career into drug treatment services, and we have a lot of really good people working in drug treatment services, but their hands are tied with what they can offer because we are given directions from the UK government. They will say that they treat this as a health issue, but they're also criminalising our most vulnerable people. 1 in 4 people currently in the prison system just now are actually in the prison system for drug use, not drug supply, not gaining anything from this. They're in there because of using drugs. And they're in there and they're coming out and they're coming straight back into the same situations. Our drug consumption facility in Glasgow last week supervised 2 injections. The people had literally walked out of the prison system that day and they came straight into Glasgow to inject drugs, and they were going to do it in an alleyway, but they had actually seen the drug consumption facility on the news and came to that instead. The police in Scotland are currently in a really difficult situation because they still have to abide by what the Crown and Procurator Fiscal and the laws say. But the laws in Scotland have devolved around policing and crime. So we can no longer, as a government, Scottish government, stand back and allow this to happen. This has been a political football getting kicked between Westminster and Holyrood now for a number of years. We were first told in 2016 that this was going to happen. We were told in 2018 that the green light had been given for a drug consumption facility. Yet we continue to debate this while people continue to die on our streets. They're dying in our alleyways, they're dying under bridges in squalid conditions. The police in Denmark say this is the best thing that's ever happened. They no longer find dead bodies on the street. The businesses around the consumption facility in Denmark and Copenhagen are absolutely flourishing because of the lack of public drug use now and the lack of discarded equipment left on the streets. The business districts in Vancouver say that they couldn't live without the drug consumption facilities. They fully support it. The residents' associations in Canada fully support it. We need to make this change now. If we don't, 2020 and continuing into next year, we're going to just see continued increases in our drug-related deaths. It's also important to reflect on why a drug consumption facility was originally spoken about within Glasgow, and that was due to the HIV outbreak. Now, in the last 5 years, Glasgow's had over 180 cases of HIV, and it's condensed amongst people who inject drugs in the city centre. We obviously have a really high ongoing problem with hepatitis C as well amongst people who inject drugs in Glasgow city centre. And that is why we originally said that, you know, a drug consumption facility would be a good idea in Glasgow because it would curtail the spread of bloodborne virus transmissions amongst people who inject drugs. Now, we've already seen that the HIV transmissions have moved outside Glasgow city centre as well now. They've moved into North Lanarkshire. So another massive reason why one of these drug consumption facilities in Glasgow would be an absolute lifesaver for many people is in terms of the bloodborne virus transmission. And I think it's also important to add that just after we set up our drug consumption facility in Glasgow, that a 17-year-old was found dead in an alleyway in Glasgow. Now, looking at my own story and the fact that I used heroin at 17 years old and injected heroin for the first time at 17 years old, it's so sad for me to think about that young person being found dead in Glasgow city centre, because I've had opportunities that not many people get, opportunities to see that for me, drug use always led to issues and problems. That's not the case for most people. 90% of the people who use drugs without any issues or problems. They always did create issues for me. I moved away from drugs and I became abstinent from drugs. And what I've got in my life now is, a beautiful marriage, 2 beautiful children, a beautiful house and relationships with my parents and the people who I love and they love me, and those opportunities. It does make me sad that those young people who are dying in Glasgow now won't ever have those opportunities, because we're simply not meeting those people where they are. They're pushed out of society. People often ask me, why do drug users discard their equipment? Why don't they put them into these bins and take them back? And I always usually have the answer that I think if society doesn't care about you and society continues to say, we don't care about you, we're going to make you go into these alleyways and under these bridges, the people get to a point where they don't care about society. But I am seeing that people who come into our consumption facility open up. One person's talked to me about an absolute life filled with sexual and violent trauma growing up. And the fact that as soon as they turned into an adult, which is at the age of 16 in Scotland, they were then traumatized by a system of criminalization. So they've spent their whole adulthood being traumatized by the system. Now they're in their 30s. You're talking about well over 20 years of continuous trauma. People need a lot in terms of the support and the wraparound services. That's what a drug consumption facility can offer. We can have health and welfare services in there. We can have drug treatment services in there. We can have social and psychological support services in there to help people deal with the issues that they come to the drug consumption facility with. So ultimately we can actually reduce drug use, which does a lot more for breaking up criminal gangs and chains than it ever will by the police busting a criminal gang, because ultimately the police bust a criminal gang, another criminal gang comes in and gets stronger. That's the simple reality of it. Drug use is here to stay. We need to look at how we're dealing with it, because it's not going away. We've tried to make it go away by forcing entry into houses and busting criminal gangs, and every now and again you'll see, on one of the police Twitter feeds, £500,000 worth of heroin found. Our streets are now safer. You go into the area where the £500,000 bust of heroin was, there's just as much heroin there. It's not getting rid of it. It's not stopping it. I mean, an international lockdown for this pandemic that we're going through, all routes into the country essentially eliminated. They still can't stop the supply of heroin coming into our system and into our society. How do they think that in normal times outside a pandemic that they're ever going to solve that? The simple reality is that the next step could be what North America is and places like Canada are seeing, and fentanyl enters into our system. And when that happens in Scotland, it's absolutely going to devastate our community and the people who use drugs. We're already at higher death rate per head of population than most other countries in the world, including America. And we don't even have fentanyl in our supply chains yet. So how that would interact with our massive issue around street benzodiazepines, alcohol, heroin, powder form cocaine, which is is injected regularly now in Glasgow, and mixing that in with the drugs that are already on our streets, you know, it would be an epidemic, you know, and a pandemic. We already have an ongoing health emergency in Scotland, and it's been ongoing for years. So I really hope that, you know, we will see some changes soon. You know, we will continue to push for those changes to be made, and please, you know, keep following and liking and you know, supporting our campaign for a more compassionate way to deal with people who use drugs.